The Crossing Borders Building Worlds discussion features Poppy Dowle, Michele McDonald, Emma Slade and moderator Jennifer Wilton. It was recorded live at the 2025 Spada Conference.
I'd like to introduce our moderator for Crossing Borders and Building Worlds. Would you please make welcome to the stage, Jennifer Wilton.
Wow, kia ora koutou. I'm Jennifer Wilton. I'm from the New Zealand Film Commission. I'm in the co-production and incentives team, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session today on Crossing Borders, Building Worlds, co-productions, powering partnership. So as funding tightens and audiences expand, producers are increasingly looking offshore for scale and opportunity. Today we'll be exploring what's changing and how New Zealand supported partnerships can go global. And joining me are three fantastic panelists. We have Poppy Dowle from Film Finances Australasia. We have Michele McDonald, Screen Australia's producer offset and co-production advisor. And we have Emma Slade from Velvet Moss, one of New Zealand's most experienced producers when it comes to official co-productions. And thank you all for being here. As well as hearing from our panelists today, I will also have some time towards the end of the session where you'll be able to ask some questions. Timing is tight, so let's start right off with some current trends. Australia, Canada and the UK are New Zealand's regular partners when it comes to official co-productions across both film and television, making up 3/4 of all official co-productions that we've certified at the Film Commission to date. But over the last 5 years, we've actually seen an uptick in co-production activity with Germany and with Ireland. So, handing over to our panel, what shifts in co-production activity are you seeing right now? Are there certain genres or territories that are emerging as hotspots? And what might the case be that we're seeing that? So Michele, would you like to go first?
Hi everyone. Yeah, in Australia we're seeing absolutely a shift more towards looking at partnering with international partners, whether that be through an official co-production or an unofficial co-pro. Funding is really hard at the moment everywhere. It's hard in Australia. So, Screen Australia and a lot of the producers are really taking the opportunity to look abroad, find the right partners in order to kind of make films that are global, reaching global audiences, and just tapping into talent pools outside of Australia as well. We have the same trends in relation to our most common partners. So our most common co-production partner is Canada. We work a lot with the UK, we work a lot with New Zealand, France, and that trend continues. So the co-productions we've seen so far this financial year, there are 2 with the UK and 1 with Ireland. We're also seeing interest in the Southeast Asian region. So we have a new treaty with India, and we know that there's quite a number of projects in development that are potential co-productions with India under that treaty. And then just generally within the kind of Asian regions, we see Australian producers looking at making films in Indonesia as more unofficial co-pros. So exploring that area as well. So definitely increasing, the numbers are going up, and yeah, it just feels like it's just an essential part of how you can get a film made moving forward.
Thanks. Poppy, would you like to come in?
Sorry. No, you go. Are you sure? Yeah,
Okay. I would echo everything Michele has said. I've been working at Film Finances for 16 years, and when I very first started, the finance plans were the simplest of structures. You'd have your government money, a bit of marketplace, and the tax credit, and you were away. And now it has turned into being this beast of how do you finance things in the government agencies. Pool of money is coming down, the marketplace isn't putting that much money in anymore. So a lot of the projects that we have as co-productions, whether it's, again, official or unofficial, is purely just how do we maximise financing and getting a project up? So there is a lot of that. I did have a quick look at the numbers, because we usually have a couple a year, and this year there may be some of these projects are in post-production and they shot last year, but I'm going to say this is this year. We currently have 9 projects that are co-productions or unofficial co-productions, and 5 of them are Australian New Zealand ones. So it's actually definitely going in a trend. So yeah,
And I think the whole entire world wants to do co-productions. I don't think there is one, even though we've obviously got those 3 territories, but I do think the whole world is up for it. And I think there is an acknowledgement that financing is extraordinarily difficult, and it is a way of potentially opening up other finance which can finance your project. But I do think that it needs to be said with a word of caution, because it is very nuanced. And I would strongly recommend to anyone who's looking at doing a co-production to research. And not only your partner and where you're going to, but also in your home territory. You really need to understand how the rebate works, and what you're able to bring to the table, because they will ask you and they'll expect you to be the expert in your own region. So it's super important that you really understand. So when you tell them that you're going down a pathway that makes sense for the two of you, because you can go quite a way down a pathway and then you realise it's actually not going to work. The other thing is the reason why those territories in particular are so popular here is it's all to do with their rebate. I mean, we've got our rebate's high, it's 40%, but it's not as high in the UK. It's high, but it's not as high, and it's been raised. It's the same in Ireland. Australia is the same as us. But you really need to look at that, because there are other charges that come in when you do a co-production. You have to do double ups. So you do double ups of legals, of accounting, of producer fees, and so on and so forth. And so you need to make sure that you don't create a false economy, because you may find that the hole in your budget actually expands by making it a co-pro and not reducing it. So you really need to think that through, and you need to be able to bring something more than just the rebate to the table, and same for your partner that you're going with. And you really, really need to make sure that you know your partner very, very well, because the risk for producers is immense, and that's not getting better, it's getting worse. And the harder and the tighter it becomes, and the budgets are really tough to hit, you have huge liability that you're taking on, and you're only as strong as your weakest partner. So you really need to think about that, because if the other side stuffs it up, it will impact you in potentially quite a severe way. I've sort of said it all now, really.
Yeah, that's it.
But I just really wanted to get that out about co-productions, because they are fabulous, and being able to work with international partners, but I just think that's really important information, because it is nuanced, and you must understand that nuance before you broach that. And I would probably encourage someone to, if you haven't done it before, work with someone who has, so you can, because there's quite a bit of threading that you have to do to not make the road less bumpy. Yeah.
I'd probably just add to that, Emma, as well. I think you do still need to look at co-productions, whether it's official or unofficial, holistically, and I think it needs to work creatively as well. So it absolutely helps with the finance, and it's one of the key drivers, but I feel like there needs to be that creative gelling as well. And, the earlier you're setting up a co-pro in development, I think the better. And there are some films that are just what we would call a natural co-pro, and that might be, and we'll just keep using Australia and New Zealand as an example, but there's an Australian writer and a New Zealand director. And, it's a story that's going to work in both marketplaces, and you're doing the work in both territories. So something like that is what we would call a natural co-pro, but it doesn't have to be like that. Co-pros are all shapes and sizes, like any film. But I think it's just bearing in mind, I always see it as a creative partnership as well as a finance. And as Emma said, it's just finding the right partner is so important, whether it's official or unofficial, because there's just so much at stake, and there's a lot of trust involved. But there's just so many amazing producers out there that I just think there's plenty of good ones to choose from.
And coming back to your question about genres and what the trends are, I think, generally speaking, at the moment there's a big push on horror, or that might be tapering off a little bit. Well, certainly in the film world, I can't speak for TV. But I do think actually any genre is kind of up for it. But it's all to do with the story, and it's important because when you understand the other country's rules and regulations, like we have our rules and regulations, and what things are culturally significant for us may not be so important to the other country. So you need to really work out what is the hoops that you have to jump through to be able to get your own funding, what hoops they have to jump through, because then you'll work out what stories might make sense for a co-production, because some will and there'll be others you go, oh, that's just not going to work. So you have to really think about the story that you're trying to tell as well.
Poppy, I've got a question for you. Can you share a success story where a co-production unlocked scale or global reach? What made it work? And what does a successful co-production look like from a bond company's point of view?
Oh, okay. I think I just want to segue also back to what you were just saying. You know, there's a lot of finance solutions that come from the co-productions, and everyone sort of looks at the tax credits to go, okay, ticks that box, we get that. The other, you know, massive contributor that makes it even more appealing is when you can get government funding from within that country. But what's really crucial is that I think you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the key part here is that you have to develop that project together before you go for the funding. So you can't just be like, I've been trying to make this work for so long, and then, oh, maybe the solution is to make it a co-pro and tack it on together. Yes, you can get the tax credit from the other country, but you're not going to get that extra government funding, which makes it really, really appealing on your finance structure to take that pressure off. So if you're thinking of doing a co-pro, if it does make a natural fit for the creative, start early together. Don't try to piece it together after the fact. I would say that's probably the key thing. Yeah. It's interesting though, because we've got a couple of projects that have had finance fall out, or like we've got one project that a producer tried to get up for about 10 years on our books, and I was just like, oh. And interestingly enough, that person was a producer in Australia, and they relocated back to Ireland, and then it was kind of like that opening of the mind of actually like, I know both countries so well, and that understanding of what each country can bring to the party, and they ended up making that an official co-production. And so after like seeing it on my books for 10 years and it finally coming to fruition, and you're like, oh, and it makes complete sense. Like, you know, they did have to rework the script to make it work for all those kind of that combination, but to me, like, that's success. You get to make your film. That's probably a big one. The other ones, it's interesting because there are like unofficial co-pros. We had one that's just been finished up earlier this year, which was shot in the Philippines, and it's really interesting because it's not an official co-production, obviously. And you would look at it at face value and say, this is a Filipino film. It's all in Tagalog, their local language. There is all the cast are Filipino, but it ticked the significant Australian content box to get the Australian funding. You know, I had a Filipino Australian writer, director, all the producers and everything else. So there's also projects where you think, oh, this, you know, can I actually utilise the different countries' finance and look closely at the guidelines? Because I think, Michelle, you can talk to this. Like, there's some projects which you think, oh, how's that Australian? But actually you tick enough boxes on the guidelines to make it count. And that's a beautiful little film. And, you know, all the heads of department went to the Philippines, and they, you know, and they're a minority financing partner, but you get so much bang for buck in some of these countries that it's amazing. Like the whole shoot was done there. And that's going to, you know, I think that's another phenomenal thing where you go, that's an Australian film. And one of the very first ones I did as well was shot in Thailand, and again, same thing. Like you go, oh, not sure how that's Australian, but when you look at it, it ticks all the boxes. So I think there's multiple ways that you can look at co-productions. Sometimes they're not as obvious as you would think, whether it's official or unofficial. And one other thing I think is for consideration is that the reason we do have so many co-producing partners is obviously like English as a language. It opens a lot of doors. So I think consolidating, the two or three English-speaking countries, you can all pile in with your finance structure and really maximise how you can do it. But I'm probably going off the question now. Sorry, you've got to stop me when I'm rambling.
You actually brought up a really good point about official versus unofficial co-productions, and I'd really love to hear from the panel, like, what are the risks and benefits of each of those? What do you need to keep in mind when you're choosing whether to go the official route or unofficial route?
Yeah. I mean, this is what I talk to producers about all the time. So in Australia, when we talk about unofficial, if producers are looking at accessing the producer offset, which is our national rebate for an Australian film, to access that, you can either be an official co-pro made under an MOU or treaty, or you pass the significant Australian content test. And the SAC test, we call it SAC, it's a holistic test and it's quite broad. So it doesn't have to be Australian on screen. I would say one of the key things is that it's creatively driven by Australians. And I wasn't involved in setting that up at all, but I think that the idea was we don't want to just restrict Australian films to be koalas on screen and that kind of thing. It's Australians looking at the world and interpreting stories as well. So the SAC test is very broad, and you can be an unofficial co-pro, which means you could be partnering with a New Zealand producer or in a New Zealand creative, and maybe then you are still eligible for the Australian producer would still be eligible for the producer offset without going down the official pathway. And I mean, there's just different risks and rewards, and it really depends on the structure of the film. Some films won't pass the SAC test because you've got a New Zealand producer and a New Zealand director, etc. And I can talk to producers, and we have those conversations and go, that's not strong for SAC, but let's have a look at co-pro, and that might be the better fit. So I think it really depends on the circumstances. Benefits of co-pro is that you're triggering the local rebates and you're considered a national film. So kind of like what Poppy was saying, you can apply to Screen Australia for content funding, New Zealand for the same, you can get state agency funding. So it does kind of unlock benefits as well, and it's Australian film for distribution, etc. But there is another layer of paperwork involved. It's another form, and there are guardrails that you have to work in as an official co-pro. And as Emma said, you really need to understand what they are. And I think for producers interested, there's a lot of support at Screen Australia and the New Zealand Film Commission if you're looking at going down that route. You absolutely, as an official co-pro, your costs will go up. You really do need a lawyer. You need a good film lawyer if you're a co-pro. You need a really good agreement with your co-producer. So that's one of the number one tips is you can't do this without a lawyer, a film lawyer. So that does increase the budget. So unofficial co-pro, there's less paperwork. You can do, you're not that extra layer, but I guess you're constricted by what the significant Australian content test is. In Australia, we'll see production companies that have a slate of films. Okay, this one is going to be a great co-pro. This one, okay, we might be able to do unofficial. This one's just all Australian. So producers will just have a slate of films, and I think it's just finding the right pathway where you're going to maximise your creative and your finance.
And it's the same in New Zealand, but the only thing to remember is that applying for a co-production and applying to the NZFC for funding are two different things. Yep. So the NZFC will have their requirements and cultural remit that they have to do, and then the co-pro is something else. So you just need to make sure that if you are wanting to go to NZFC funding as well, that you make sure that you're jumping through their hoops. That's really important. Don't just assume that it's the same thing, because it's not. And the other thing is that if you, like, Australia's very lucky to have Michele here. New Zealand is very lucky because we've also got a wonderful co-pro unit, which Jennifer is part of, and we also have Mark, and we also have Chris. So they're really great at answering any questions and helping guide people. Yes, because there are two ways to access the 40%. It's either through a cultural test or it's through an official co-pro. And if you do an unofficial co-pro, it's basically a cultural test. It's the same thing. It's essentially the same thing.
Yep. So what are some of the common pitfalls that you've seen when it comes to official co-productions, and how can producers effectively avoid these, hopefully?
I know I've got a long list, but I want to be really positive because it's such a great thing. I just think it's who you work with, like Emma was saying, and whenever I talk to Australian producers, you know, before I come and do a panel like this, or if I'm at an industry event, it's one of the first things is just finding the right partner. And taking the time to find the right partner. And it is, I think, a longer game, co-production. So when I ask people, well, how did you meet, you know, your co-producer? How did you guys meet? You know, it really is about travelling. It's about going to markets. It's about doing your research. You know, what kind of content is, you know, such and such production company making. Okay, that aligns with my values. I'll reach out to them. But it is, it's travelling and, you know, just meeting people along the way and chasing those opportunities. So I think that's a longer game. And this is so boring, but Emma just said it, so that's good. But it is just understanding the processes. And I think there is a lot of bureaucracy involved when you're doing co-productions. But, you know, it can unlock millions of dollars. So hang in there and, you know, persevere with it. And just understanding the what happens. So if you're an official co-pro, the first thing you do is you want to make sure your co-production eligibility is in place. So you're going co-pro, and this is how it is for us, co-pro, then you apply to our content funding team for content funding, and then you'll come in and get the rebate. So for us, it's in that order. But yeah, not everyone, you know, people might be coming into us for the rebate, and it's like, well, hang on, we've got to put that aside. We've got to do your co-pro first. So you absolutely just need to understand the process, and again, we can help you, and it is very bureaucratic, I'm just going to say it. Think about it from the beginning. Trying to retrofit a co-production's really hard. And in fact, most of the treaties say you can't. Most of the treaties will say you have to have that provisional approval before you start shooting, which is, I think, really helpful for everybody because then you're not kind of backtracking. There are absolutely guardrails that you need to work within, and I'd say one of the you know, pitfalls is if you've got a director who wants, you know, you're making an Australian New Zealand co-pro, but your director wants this amazing US DOP. It's really important for your key creatives to understand that just can't happen under a co-pro, and that under a co-production you've got to work with people from the two territories. You can have cast from non-party in most of the treaties. Usually that means American cast, and that helps with financing. But really the crew usually would be from the two territories. And so just having everyone just be on board with that, I guess, I think is really important. Just transparency and trust with your producer, and looking at it as the one production. I guess we've seen co-pros where the Australian partner may not be across the expenditure of the co-producer, and it's shooting in another territory, and then it comes to post and there's been a bit of an overblow, and all of a sudden there's less money in post. So again, when I talk to production accountants, people like Entertainment Partners in Sydney who do a lot of co-pros, they always will set it up as one global budget that both producers are overseeing, and that there's just a lot of transparency in, you know, who's spending what and where. And also, and I think just psychologically as well, just seeing it as the one production, like not two separate kind of productions, is helpful. And I think, again, just having really trusted advisors, and I'm not spruiking the lawyers, but yeah, getting a good lawyer and accountant. And again, we would always recommend, if you're embarking on a co-pro for the first time, you know, just maybe it's worth getting an EP who's done one before, an executive producer, and helping guide you through it. That can be really helpful as well. And if you do all that, it's fine. Yeah. But it is, I think there's just nuances to it. And I just think there's nuances to making a film, whether you're a co-pro or not, right? So I think it's just getting your head around it. And I think Australia and New Zealand as territories are really lucky that I think there's a lot of support within the agencies for helping producers kind of navigate it. But anyway, you might have more.
Oh yeah. stories. Well, I'll just elaborate on a couple of the things. I think, as both of Emma and Michele have mentioned, like, understand the parameters on which the other country has to operate as well. Quite frequently we will see co-productions where you might be doing the whole shoot in another country and then the post-production's being done in Australia, for example, and there is a little bit, does tend to be a bit of a tendency to put a bit of blinkers on to say, well, we're just handling the post, we don't have to be that invested in what's happening during the shoot. But there is the very, very delicate balance when it comes to, in order to get your provisional co-production certificate, you have to demonstrate that you've got a percentage split on your financing and then a percentage split on your expenditure. And it is that thing where if you're not both countries, or if you've got a three-way co-production, if you're that mad, but you have to be, you both have to have eyes on the ball for both countries. You can't just set and forget and then be surprised when you inherit something when it comes back to your country. So I would say production lawyers, great, especially if you've got production lawyers who have done co-productions before, because I think they are so full of knowledge that can help guide producers as well in that world. And even for the trend at the moment is that the finance models, even if it's a straightforward film, is looking at so much international money now that there's all these implications and complexities that come with that, and having somebody who has experience with that will be able to guide you better to avoid some of these pitfalls. You can only move as fast as your slowest lawyer or partner. And there is timing that has to be considered. Like, for example, sorry, I'm just going to speak for Emma here. She's got a co-pro at the moment between Australia and New Zealand. And, in order to get your provisional, both countries have to sign off on their provisional certificate to say they both agree it's a co-pro. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And the New Zealand Film Commission, sorry, Michele, no offence, but they move a bit faster. So they're like, we've got our provisional from, the letter from New Zealand. And it's like, well, no, you've got to wait till Australia does theirs as well. It's, you really have to be embedded in the other country to understand all of those little idiosyncrasies which impact you in a huge way. And I think perhaps one of the Irish-Australian co-production that we've got at the moment has gone so well is because the Irish producer is so fluent in the Australian market that he understands it inside out. And so it's the ideal thing that you understand down to the nitty-gritty about how both countries work is your best place to be, I think. And every project we do, I learn about another tax incentive in another country and all the quirks and how to make some fun sort of spreadsheets up. But what else would I say? I think just the complexity of contracting as well. Like the average project you would hope could be contracted in 8 to 12 weeks, but co-pros they're beasts to navigate that many parties. And just the cultural differences of how people operate. If you want to be doing a project which is contracting in January, that Australia and New Zealand, all the lawyers are having their summer holidays, so nothing happens. And then equally, Northern Hemisphere are having their summer holidays in the middle of the year, so things drag out. So it's all those little things that can have an impact. But yes, get to know who your partner is. Really get to know them. You're about to get into bed with them for a long time, and you've got to ride that way.
I'd also want to say about when you do a production schedule, that because it's really important to time out when everything will happen, because closing does take longer, and generally speaking, New Zealand is faster than anywhere else, and generally speaking, the Film Commission is faster. So, but that's, in a way, it's irrelevant because you can only go as fast as your slowest partner. So you need to build that time in. So when you do your production schedule, make sure you allow and you map out what closing will take, and then you do your prep, you shoot, your post, and your delivery, but also go, when you do your production schedule, go beyond that. Work out when the money will come back, because Australia takes a long time to come back, much longer than, or not much longer, but longer than New Zealand. Canada takes ages. And if you're paying interest on that money, you have to sit and wait. I mean, it is great that we have an interim, so if you're shooting here and your bulk of your money goes out, you can do the interim, and that's a bit of a lifesaver, to be honest. But you're still tied up with a bit of cash that you might be waiting to come back. So you really need to understand what the other side has to do and how they get their money back. And you can't get your money back in until the co-production is actually officially all signed off. So really understand the tail end, because it may impact you, and you have to make sure you allow enough money in your budget to actually pay for it. I know it's getting into the weeds, but if people are genuinely interested in it, that's what you've got to do.
I could do a whole subject on foreign exchange right now. But I would say, like New Zealand has the magic. You guys have had this introduced as an interim rebate thing. That changes, game changer. But you know what? There are other countries where you don't have to take out the loan because they actually cash flow it. So I think South Africa, unless that's changed, and in Ireland, they will actually be putting the money down. You're not paying for the interest rates on that, which, again, another massive game changer. And when you're looking at taking out loans, you also need to look at that timing and say, well, if we can get X amount of money up front without loans from that country, can you be transferring that money across to the other country rather than taking out a loan? And that's where I will stop with the foreign exchange, because sending money backwards and forwards is wild. But it's, the finance plans and cash flows.
Yeah, and you want to set up a currency account in the other country for yourself. So if money comes in and you're going to be sending it right back, which is a bit more detailed than that, but just to know, it's helpful to set up the other country you're working with, their currency in New Zealand, and they do the same for you in New Zealand dollars. So you don't have to lose currency. But there's lots of tricks to do around currency that you need to also have your eyes open with. But we have brilliant lawyers here, and get yourself a great accountant as well, because you're going to need them.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. I mean, this has been amazing insights, and I'm conscious that we're getting towards the end of the session now. Yeah, getting the countdown. So I'm going to give you one last opportunity to say a few things, maybe just one word. So, looking ahead, one or two words. Looking ahead for the next 5 to 10 years, what region or area or territory do you see the biggest opportunity for growth when it comes to official co-productions? So you can answer that question, or if you were to sum up the future of co-productions in just one word, what would it be? So you can do either or, territory or
I'll go first. I'm not going to do the one word. I can't do one word answers. I would say the trend I'm loving at the moment is the New Zealand-Australia co-production. It is a real natural fit because we are so similar in rebates. I'm sure somebody wrote one and did a copy and paste. But anyway, that's all great. But my point being, see, now I've lost. Oh, Australia? No, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. Okay. So we're very similar. But the one advantage with what seems to be making the most sense at the moment is that you would shoot in New Zealand, but then take your post-production over to Australia, because each state in Australia has a post-production incentive where you can get 10%, or if you go to Western Australia, 20.
What, 20?
Is she lying to you? It's 20%, up to 20%. All right, I don't know.
More.
There's more. But yeah, it's a good balance.
Michele?
I'm going to say one word, relationships. I think it's the future.
And I think co-productions are essential.
Yeah.
I think they're going to be part of our financing model going forward. So we all need to really understand it. But they're not always the right way. They're just something else in your toolkit. So understanding it is important, I think. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And do we have time for one or two questions from the floor? Great, I think I can see one over there.
I don't think I'm going to need that. Emma, I'd love you to share what you shared yesterday about minority co-productions in this room.
Sure. This is interesting, because you're completely right. Shooting in New Zealand and then doing posts in Australia is a great thing, because there is a PDV grant which is on top of their rebate, which is awesome. And then sometimes you might even get more cash on top of that, which we were lucky to do in Western Australia. But I do believe that it should be reciprocal, because I think that once you go through such a huge journey with the partner that you're working with, that once you've established that working relationship and you still love each other at the end of it, hopefully, that you'll be willing to go back and have another go at it and do another project. So generally speaking, with the not all of them, but the co-production partners that I've worked with, I do want to do business again, but I do think it needs to be reciprocal. And it is challenging if you're going to shoot in New Zealand and post in Australia, that's all good and well, but if you want to flip it and you shoot in Australia and you post in New Zealand, we need to be able to offer something more than just the rebate, because Australia already has the 40%. So if we can only offer 40%, it means nothing to them. All it is extra. There's no incentive. It's just additional costs. So you need to find other money to bring to the table, and I would suggest that maybe putting in a little application to the NZFC. But you'd have to make sure it's relative to what the ask is and what you're, what being a minority co-production partner, or you may find equity from here or whatever you may find, but you just have to be mindful of that for minority co-pros to be able to do a reciprocal type arrangement.
Great. Do we have any other questions out there? I can't see any. Right, well, thank you very much for your insights today. I've learned a lot. It's been really great talking to you. And for everyone else for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.